We may be rushed for time, but I'd be glad to field any questions if anybody wants to raise any. No government, right. It's a form of pure voluntarism. It's a very ideal situation, which I don't think we can achieve probably in the next couple of generations, but we should aim for 100% and hopefully try to get 70 or 80% as soon as we can, whereas by aiming for merely neighborhood control right now, we're lucky if we get 50% of it. If we consider our present element of statism as being 70 or 80% right now on the spectrum from 0 to 100% of totalitarianism, I think we should aim for 0 state control and hope to get 20 or 30% as soon as possible. And then from there, we can start leading our little resistance movements against the neighborhood fascists. But again, what you're asking me to do is define how a police system, a court system, a defense system, an education system, a welfare system, the whole gamut of social institutions would run on an individualist level. And I can only refer to certain... Pardon? Monopolistic, absolute authority over a given geographical area. Authority to do anything, whether it's limited to police or to defense or judicial systems, or whether it has absolute authority to do anything. It's still a government. I'm against all forms of government. I would, the argument, if you're trying to sell limited government, I would say that any form of government is self-aggrandizing, and that how is your limited government going to maintain its monopoly except by interfering with free market voluntary transactions in the case of people who want to secede from that government. So if you have a limited government with a monopoly over police forces and law courts, and I decide I can get my services, my police protection better and cheaper from somebody else, either you step in with the police and stop me, which is a violation of a free market transaction, you no longer have a limited libertarian government, or you can allow it to exist, in which case your government becomes a competitor in a free market anarchist society. Yeah. Yeah, I'm perfectly willing to drop left-right terminology altogether, which is terribly confusing. I agree with you. When people ask me what I am, I'm a free market anarchist, I'm a libertarian, and leave it at that. But unfortunately, every time some reporter or some journalist talks about these libertarians at Columbia, these libertarians, they call it right-wing libertarianism. They have been constantly identifying the libertarian split off with the right wing as if we're just another little family squabble. And for this reason, we are almost forced to define what we mean by left and right. We might have some fun with trying, just for personal amusement, defining ourselves. What are each one of us? Am I a psychological right-winger, a leftist, a political leftist, and a political right-winger, or what? I mean, I would consider myself a psychological right-winger and a political leftist according to my terms. I'm perfectly willing to use strictly free market anarchism to define myself, but when other people are labeling right or left all the time, you've really got to come up with definitions to define what you mean by when you use the term, strictly for that reason. Yeah, but when the neighborhood Hitler lives next door to you, you have a closer contact with him, and you can knock him off his throne a lot easier, more easily. It's a matter of breaking down political power into small units so it becomes more visible, so the bastards can't hide in an enormous bureaucracy. It's just so. Well, I'm not holding up neighborhood government as an ideal situation. I'm willing to work. My ideal is total individual freedom. Now, I regard Jeffersonians as allies in the sense that they are willing to break power down to that small of a unit. Now, if you do have a really decentralized political system, neighborhood government, and so on, and if it becomes oppressive and totalitarian, well, the individual always has the right of self-defense against anybody who aggresses against them, if it's a robber or a neighborhood Hitler or one in Washington, D.C. The idea is to get them down closer and closer to the individual so you can see them, and you know who they are, and they're not hiding constantly. That's the main thing about working for decentralization, not as an ideal, but as a stepping stone to what we want. You can turn the scale on it vertically if you like. I'm not against that. Well, I think by breaking it down into a psychological, because when I talk about psychological level, I'm talking about psychological in its broadest sense, incorporating explicit philosophical principles and also subconscious emotional attitudes toward people. And I think that it is helpful to separate the political in this spectrum from the psychological spectrum, because, I mean, people who are individualists and people who are what you might call neighborhood collectivists, in a sense, can work together in the present political situation, and as we can see that psychological collectivists and psychological supposedly individualists can work together on the right-wing political sphere. So it's just a matter of finding out who we can work with, and trying to give some clarification to the whole terminology of left and right, which I agree is terribly confusing and is misused by almost everybody. So it's really an attempt to throw some light on terminology. Garrett. Of course you do, Jarrett. Well, weekend retreatism isn't too bad. In fact, I enjoy it myself, camping and so on. But where is your new world going to be? A platform is hardly a frontier land with 30 million square miles. And But all I can say to you right now, Jared, is that right now I'm primarily interested in maintaining my private piece of property without paying rent in the form of property taxes to a government, without supporting a god-awful war halfway around the world and so on. I live in a society, and I want to preserve my freedom instead of really retreating or running off somewhere else now. Granted, the options that existed a couple of hundred years ago, I really don't think exist anymore, unless you come up with a private space program and get people to homestead Mars or someplace like that. But I still want to be able to live like a civilized human being in this society which I happen to be born into. And my main thrust is toward doing something about the current political regime that I find myself enmeshed in. I really don't regard platforms and caves under the ground as a serious alternative for rational individualist freedom. Sorry. Well, I mean, there's a great need for a real underground network to escape when people are running after you. I agree with you there. But I mean, as a final solution to what currently exists, I don't see it. Jared, you're free to go. If you want to, go ahead. Okay. In a free market anarchist society, of course, there is room for arbitration. There is what I would consider, I think there is, somebody might sit down and write a libertarian law code, which is truly libertarian in the sense that it's limited to protecting life and property by defending people from aggression, which might take the form of physical aggression, which might take the form of slander and ruining somebody's reputation through lying, which might take the form of contract violation. There are many forms of aggression, of course, and there is room in a free market anarchist society to recognize these types of aggressions. I think we can get toward a libertarian code more efficiently, as we do anything more efficiently, with competition and free market competition among competing tribunals, just as better concrete products find a wider audience and a greater market when they become available on the free market. I think a greater dissemination of justice would also find its market if people are allowed to compete against the monopolistic service that now exists. There are many. If two people have a disagreement with one another, they have two things. They can resolve their differences in two different ways. They can either go out in the street and fight it out, in which case, if it's purely voluntary, they should be allowed to do so. Or they can submit to a panel of arbitration and agree to abide by the decision that is made. Now, a criminal offense, if a man is an actual aggressor against somebody physically, there are many different options. It may be that you would have a neighborhood court system which is based on libertarian principles, in which case he would be a criminal within their sphere of influence in the neighborhood, and he would be subject to the rule of this court decision. In the case of robbery, you might have somebody with crime insurance who is reimbursed through an insurance policy, and then it would behoove the insurance company to go and catch the criminal and bring him before a libertarian tribunal. But in any case, he would certainly be either have to recompense the the individual for the stolen property, or he would have to be incarcerated if he's judged to be a permanent threat against other people. He obviously is insane in this case. Because he'll be taken there physically if he's well, on an international level, you have the same problem. Don't you have people escaping to who commit crimes in the United States going to Canada or Mexico to avoid justice? There are reciprocal agreements from one jurisdiction to another. Yeah. Well, just as on an international level, you do have reciprocal agreements. I think if you broke it down to an individual level with free market principles at work, the reciprocation would be far more fluid than it is right now. Right, but why couldn't individuals make more rational reciprocal arrangements than governments do? I used to submit that they could. If he committed a crime in a certain area, he's subject to the local gendarmerie, whoever it happens to be. If he committed a crime against somebody in a certain apartment building, which is protected by Pinkertons, they will capture him. They will get him and bring him before. I think that if it were possible to maintain a purely libertarian limited government indefinitely, certainly nobody's going to be try to break out of the system. It's 1,000 times better than what we have right now. What I'm saying, though, there is a debate on the subject following, and I don't want to get too much into this to undercut somebody else's arguments, but what I'm saying is that government is by its nature self-aggrandizing. It depends on power blocks, votes, and money for campaigns to get themselves elected into power. By its very nature, it is disposed toward granting largesse to certain patsies, to favored groups in society. And not only that, but when you do have a situation where people want to secede, which is a voluntary act, how do you stop them from doing so and setting up their own alternatives? And once you do that, you have no government anymore. So this is really what it breaks down to. If you could keep your limited government limited indefinitely and libertarian at the same time, fine, but I don't think it's possible, particularly not now with this. How are you going to decentralize everything you have now and break it down to a libertarian structure? I think it almost becomes imperative to challenge its authority at every level and try to create your own alternatives at the same time. You want to? I think that's all we have time for, so thank you very much.
I want to thank you, Jerry. I think you've helped get this off on a very interesting start. The subject of anarcho-capitalism versus limited government is going to get a more thorough treatment in this program today. I'd ask you, when you're talking to speakers not dealing with that subject directly, that you try not to ask those questions, try to deal more with the subject of the talk. There will be plenty of opportunity to discuss and argue these questions out during the debate that will be coming up.